Hey, everybody. Aloha and welcome. So good to see you again. I'm Natalie. This is Life After a Cult, a channel where we expose cult nonsense, we laugh at the absurdity, and we hopefully unbrainwash ourselves in the process. Today, we're diving into one of Scientology's most bizarre but foundational ideas, the concept of becoming clear. Can you actually erase trauma and painful memories? Well, we're bringing on an expert today to find out. I want to thank everybody for being here in the live chat. Thank you. Thank you, moderators, for helping out. If you are on the replay, please jump into those comments with your questions, what you think. How would you answer the questions that we're tackling today? And same thing in the chat. I'm going to try and keep an eye out for questions so I can star those. So if you could put question or comment, if you want one to be addressed, I'm going to try and grab as many as I can. Farrell, Cheryl, good to see you. I'm so glad you're here. Hey, Abigail, I know you're listening in the car, so if there's any interpretive dance, I will explain for you what's happening. All right, everybody. And if you could all do me a solid, hit that like button on your way in. Let's get those notifications going and always check your subscribe as well. All right, without further ado here, you guys know Jordan Horan. He is a psychologist. He teaches critical thinking. What more can we ask for? And we've had him on the channel before. He also recently did an interview with Aaron Smith-Levin on growing up in Scientology. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you for having me back. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed our last conversation, and I'm looking to forward to this conversation as well.
I am too. I'm curious. So you've been on my show, you've done growing up in Scientology. We had some of your students join before. What do your students think about all this?
Definitely interested. Today I was kind of pulling them and being like, hey, what were you guys' thoughts? I think just kind of what a lot of people think of, like, that idea, right, of like how are people getting involved in these cults, like how are they getting out, kind of a lot of the things that we talked about was just still kind of going through their mind, and they thought it's just an interesting phenomena, right, to talk about, because in just kind of general discourse in day-to-day conversation we use the term cult and we kind of throw it around, but I think the other thing too is that our conversation made it real, that people are actually affected by these high pressure groups, cults, and that they come at a serious cost. So it seemed, just if I had to infer a little bit, that the students that probably struck them the most.
That just really made it real. Northern Girl has a great question. Did you give your students extra points for joining the chat last week?
Yeah, so not specifically for joining the chat, but they did get extra credit if they wrote a reflection paper. I really wanted them to pull from, hey, what was the discussion about? What stood out to you? Relating some of the psychological processes that we've either covered in class or will kind of thinking ahead about some future ideas related to high pressure groups and these kind of things. Yeah. So I think next week, I'm teaching introductory psychology. So it's called a survey course. We talk about all the different areas of psychology. And next week, we're actually talking about social psychology. And a lot of the phenomena of cults is related to social psychology. So I think and there's a chapter in our textbook that actually covers it. And I think I'm going to expand that a little bit more and draw some of the parallels to really drive home some of these points in the social psychological phenomena we know about and how they're related to these cults and these kind of things. So I'm looking forward to that. And I think the students are going to be looking forward to that as well. And again, even today's lecture, we were talking about stress. We were talking about PTSD and, drawing connections as well to being in cults. And I forget all the examples off the top of my head, but we were drawing those connections as well. So yes, that's my long-winded answer of yes, they got credit for doing a reflection paper.
That's fantastic. I find it fascinating to chat with you about these things, and I find it inspiring, and it warms my heart as a cult survivor that your students are getting an education on what to look for, how to recognize pseudoscience, how to recognize these high control groups and not fall victim. And I mean, just think of how many people armed with that information will never end up being sucked into a group like Scientology.
And honestly, that's one of the reasons I love teaching introduction to psychology, is because we know in general, most people who attend higher education, it's typically one of the required gen ed courses that most students take. And so I love it because we can talk about all these phenomena that are related to real world experience, and then sharpen their critical thinking skills, sharpen their skills about identifying science versus pseudoscience, so they then can make informed decision. So then they can say, oh yeah, we talked about how some of these, persuasion tricks work, or how some of these cults work. So then they can divert themselves from these potentially unfortunate situations. So you're right.
Yeah, good. I love that. Let's see. There's one other question I wanted to grab before we jumped fully into this. Lily is asking, would any of your students be interested in studying recovery from cults or cult therapy?
I haven't asked them specifically about that, but maybe I will ask them when we meet next week, because that's a really good question, and it's got me thinking more too about, like, as a clinician, if I have a client who has experienced these cults, like, are there some potential differences in the way that we would work with them, or like some things we would have to steer conversations towards more than others. So that's actually just been on my mind in general. So I'm not sure about my students, but I'll definitely ask them that of what their kind of aspirations are that way.
Yeah, and I think it's great too that the chat, our audience, now is kind of like vested in your students.
Yeah. yes, very much appreciated, and I'm sure they appreciate it as well. So I'll I gave them that encouragement, and I said, hey, people were really impressed with you guys, and of course too, as the instructor, it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside of, like, okay, like I can kind of brag about them, like, yes, these are my students, look how good they're doing. I won't take all of the credit, but it is a good sign, and you're right, it's nice to see that how interested the people in the chat are about the students. So that's great.
Yeah, definitely. This is a great question, which is related to what we're about to dive into. Cricket Cinema is asking, have you seen the TV show Homecoming with Julia Roberts?
I have not.
It's basically about using medication to erase traumatic memories.
Interesting.
But it's kind of it's not, of course, similar to what we're talking about in Dianetics, but it kind of is, because we're kind of talking about, can you erase traumatic memories? Now, in Scientology, there's a state called clear. And this is a state where a person has supposedly gotten rid of their reactive mind, which in Scientology, the belief is that's the part of the mind that stores those traumatic experiences, or in Scientology, they're called engrams. And Scientology teaches that a clear is a person who has no irrational fears, no psychosomatic illnesses, or unwanted emotions. And the interesting thing is, the vast majority of us in Scientology who will admit it have never met anyone who has had those results. I myself achieved the state of clear and did some of the upper confidential levels in Scientology, and definitely most of that would not fit me. But that's kind of the general idea about a clear in Dianetics and in Scientology. Is it's a person who is freed from the influence of those engrams, which in Scientology, that means it's a recorded moment of pain or unconsciousness. We talked a little bit about Dianetics before. The book Dianetics goes into that a lot, along with the Dianetics procedure. What are your thoughts when it comes to this idea of getting rid of this reactive mind? Can you actually, like, erase your trauma?
No. um, the research on memory. So if we start kind of broad on memory, this has been a pseudoscientific idea that has been a part of psychology going back to Freud. And if we can make a lot of comparisons to some of Freudian psychoanalytic ideals, which Hubbard clearly lifted. But so memory. So if we start just generally in memory, the way that the human mind works, the human memory works, is not like a video recorder. So a lot of people, when we've polled the general population and asked people, do you believe that the human mind is like, can make these exact copies of whatever? And there's a decent percentage of people that do. That's just kind of a thing that we think. But the psychological science is clear on this. It is not true. Our memories are reconstructions. Our memories are influenced by our moods, by our cultures, by the time of day. There are various influences into how our memories work. And when we're calling to mind a memory, it's actively being reconstructed. And specifically in psychological therapy, this actually played out in the public sphere in the early 90s, because there was a group of clinicians who claimed that that people had quote unquote repressed memories, right? Oh, I had there was this memory, it's locked in my mind and I'm not conscious of it. And throughout the 90s, like, people started making claims. Former clients were making claims of sexual abuse that never occurred, being possessed by demons, like it was this huge thing. And so in the history of psychology, we call it the repressed wars memory. And again, what was happening, it was the therapists were probably influencing the memories. And this leads to my other point. How does memory work? Memories are easily influenced. One of the best memory researchers, her name is Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. And one of the assignments my students actually do is they watch one of her YouTube videos. You can go to YouTube, go to her TED Talk, and she talks about her research in false memories. That's explicit what she studied. And she studied this since the 1970s. She's been an expert witness in court cases about how memories work and false memories work. And to give you this sense of how malleable our memories are, she's done studies where she had participants watch a video and of a car accident. So all these participants would watch this video, and then depending on which group, she would change the wording of a question. And she would say, how fast was the car going when it hit the other car? And another group heard the phrase, how fast was the car going when it smashed the other car? And that was, though smashed and hit were the only two words that were changed. Based on that questioning, participants reported if they heard smashed, they estimated that the car was actually going faster. Like, I think it was 46 miles per hour versus the other group that heard hit was like 30 some miles per hour. The group that heard the word smashed misremembered seeing broken glass. So they were actively reconstructing and putting in and saying, yeah, there was glass in that video. I saw it, like this and this. And there was none. All she did was change the phrasing of her word. And that's just one example. There have been numerous examples where she's gotten people, her and other researchers have gotten people to believe that they were lost in a mall as a child. Gotten people to believe that they hated a certain type of ice cream. Like, to implant false memories is actually pretty easy, unfortunately. So this gets what I'm trying to do is show that this idea that our memories are encoded perfectly is completely inconsistent with the science of memories.
See, and that's interesting because L. Ron Hubbard said the reactive mind records everything exactly. So
Yes.
you're basically saying science says no.
Correct. Science says no, that our memories are highly suggestible. Now, this doesn't mean that memories aren't useful and these kind of things. What my students and I talk about, and the one thing that I think is really important is just to understand the strengths and the limitations of our abilities. And memory is one thing that is highly malleable. Another thing that I think is really interesting about when we talk about traumatic memories and being repressed, one of the very easy ways to falsify this belief or to show that that's false, we have a diagnosis called PTSD. PTSD is over remembering traumas. These are not being forgotten. When people experience traumatic things, they tend to over remember. They tend to be oversensitive to cues. So, for example, maybe certain locations. Let's say a person develops PTSD as the result of a car accident. They may be incredibly anxious just sitting in the car because the car is a cue to that memory. So again, our environments can trigger certain cues and these kind of things. So when I hear people talking about the Freudian ideals or L. Ron Hubbard talking about these engrams that are encoded perfectly, it's just not true. It's actually kind of the opposite. So that's a great question. And again, an area of pseudoscience that has been with us for a very long time, of that our memories are repressed and they're stored perfectly somewhere in our mind. And then it's, in the Freudian sense, it's up to us to uncover them. But it also begs the question, like, if memories are completely unconscious or subconscious or whatever term you want to use, it's like, how exactly are they being stored then? Right? Like, you would have to go through that and explain that, and like, how are they not influencing other memory? There's a lot of problems it raises. So again, I'm belaboring the point because it's really important. I really want people to understand is that our memories are reconstructed. Can I give you another example of how memory is reconstructed?
Yeah, please do.
One of the demonstrations that I use with my students, I tell them, and for those of you listening, if you will, I'll say, okay, let's close our eyes, and I want you to think about.
Everybody close your eyes. Come on, this is group participation. If you're on the replay, I better see some eyes closed.
If you're driving, please don't close your eyes, but close your eyes.
Yes, Abigail, do not close your eyes. You're driving. Everybody else, close your eyes.
So close your eyes, and I want you to call to mind a time when you were walking along the beach, or you were walking along a pond, or you were just walking along some body of water. Just take a second to kind of recall that memory. And then I tell my students, okay, open your eyes. And then I ask them, what did you recall? And what some people report is it's called like an observer memory. Mm-hmm. Some people will tell me they remember that it's like, I was watching myself walk along the beach. How can you watch yourself? Like, that is an inherent demonstration of how the memory is reconstructed, of believing and thinking that you saw yourself walk along the beach.
Yeah.
That's impossible, right?
Yeah.
So again, it suggests that our minds can do these things with our memories, and our memories are not perfect recorders.
You're right, because seeing it, and when I just closed my eyes and did that, I was imagining both. I saw myself walking like I was a drone.
Yep.
And then I saw the water from my point of view.
Yep.
Where I was. So that is interesting. You're right. You're right, because that can't be a memory. Seeing yourself, unless there was a mirror.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a very concrete example of how our memories, what we think we remember, is not 100%. And it's a pretty simple demonstration.
I love that. Do you think there's any danger around framing trauma as something that can be or should be erased? Because the whole thing with
Mm,
Dianetics and Scientology is that you're in Scientology, erasing is called as ising. You're seeing it exactly as it is, as it was, and therefore it ceased to exist or it ceased to have a negative effect on you.
mhm. Are you saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, are you saying like what would happen if we got rid of our memories or maybe traumatic memories?
Yeah, like
Maybe,
in
sorry, I might not be understanding you. Sorry.
Yeah, so in Dianetics, it's this idea of you're erasing these engrams, and so then
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
basically just become a memory, something that you can recall.
Hmm.
And being that they're not completely accurate, and as I'm thinking this through now, I mean, you kinda answered it because there really is it's been scientifically proven that our memory is not an exact
Hmm.
accounting of what happened. So how could you in Dianetics or in Scientology go through, they call it an incident or a time of, pain and unconsciousness and actually accurately recall it, especially if it involved some level of unconsciousness. Because they're saying that even in utero, that people can go back and recall, having and L. Ron Hubbard says it causes engrams if a pregnant mother, say, has an orgasm, that it contracts and it harms the baby.
Yeah, so those ideals too, again, like if I could pick real quick on, when I was reading, right, about like, oh, these engrams are encoded like when the fetus is developing. As far as I can tell, we need a fully formed brain, and there are certain areas of the brain that are related to memories. And if a fetus, which is by definition not fully formed, I'm not sure how they would have memories of that happening or how that would like get encoded into whatever, like those traumatic
Yeah,
engrams. So
yeah,
that again seems incredibly implausible to me.
yeah.
Now, if I could bring me back around if you have to, but my mind kind of goes to, and I was thinking about this earlier. There are some people who postulate that stress, a mother's stress
Mhm.
is unhelpful for a developing fetus related to releasing corticosteroids and those kind of things, and these stress hormones in the body could maybe be problematic, which is like, yeah, I could see that, and that uh potentially that there may be some different stress responses between males who have been circumcised immediately after birth and maybe those who haven't. So there are some potential physiological reactions, but that is completely different than saying like this thing has been stored in your memory perfectly. So if L. Ron Hubbard was just to say, yeah, there might be something about, stress responses for a mother passing it on affecting the biology of the child, I'd be like, okay, we can stop there. Yep, fair. But again, going back to this idea of like these memories and these kind of things, that's just completely implausible. Um,
Yeah, I can even tell you. So L. Ron Hubbard said, and this is an exact quote from Dianetics, the engram is a complete recording down to the last accurate detail of every perception present during a moment of pain or unconsciousness.
there's some other phenomenal psychological research regarding like attention and memory. So, for example, another reason why our memories just aren't perfect recordings. I mean, think about it. If I asked you, recall your favorite birthday party, it would be incredibly implausible for you to recall every single detail, no matter how hard you try. And I'm talking things like exactly who was there, what you were wearing, what exact toy you got, right? Like in these kind of things, because our attention, we only have a limited amount of attention. Attention, we could consider like attention fuel. And the way the human mind works is we attend to the most salient features of our environment, the most useful features of an environment. And so a lot of that stuff, it's not useful to record. We can't record it. We're not recording it. And if we are, I don't know how you would access it. So even then, like getting down to some of these smaller details. Can I give you another example? Again, I love talking about memory. I love bringing into the science of this. So let's talk about, for example, even stressful events are not perfectly remembered, right? For example, let's say that, and kind of trigger warning for people out there, but let's say that you're at a bank and someone walks in with a gun to rob the bank, okay? There's a phenomena that is called the weapons focus effect. People who have been in stressful situations where a weapon is present, where does their attention go? To the weapon.
Yeah.
They're not picking up other details and other sources of memory. So in attending to those things. Why? Because it's probably not useful. It's probably, this is a weapon, I need to focus on it and go right here, right? So that phenomena, the weapons focus effect, when we're trying to get eyewitness accounts from people about bank robberies and these kind of things, they tend to not really remember a lot of important characteristics, or they misremember a lot of important characteristics because they're focused on one aspect, which is the gun. So again, even that stressful situation, when we ask people to do these kind of things, they can't recall all of those details, and or they misrecall those details. So the weapons focus effect is another psychological phenomena that suggests we can't record all the details.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. And it also makes sense in that in Scientology, you'll address a certain incident. So say if it's you got bit by a dog as a child and you're really upset about it. And if it doesn't like resolve or blow, it's referred to in Scientology, you go, it's called earlier similar. Is there an earlier similar time you were bit by a dog? And there's no rules, like you can go back millions or trillions of years to the time you got bit by a space dog. How would you explain, and it could be as simple as it's just imagination, I don't know, the recollection in or what's being said as being recollection in Scientology auditing of, say, previous lifetimes?
And again, that's another thing too, right? Of like, okay, my question always is, how do you know? What is the evidence that you have existed before? And just because I said so is not a good scientific answer, right? Because anybody could say that and anybody can make it up. And then when we talk about one of my favorite research articles that I reread this past weekend, because I think I'm going to probably publish something on Dianetics as a pseudoscience stuff. So I was rereading one of my favorite articles, and it's called, the article was written by Scott Lilienfeld, who is one of my intellectual heroes. He was a clinical psychologist who actually did a lot of work of science versus pseudoscience, and so fostering critical thinking. And him and some colleagues wrote an article about what they called CSTEs, causes of spurious treatment effects. Basically, why do clinicians, researchers, and other people, why do they believe that ineffective or harmful psychotherapies seem to work? And going back to Dianetics, right? You hear people say, oh, it worked for me. I did this. It could just be that people are misattributing how effective it is. And again, the clinician, I'm kind of bouncing around a little here. So if this isn't making sense, please stop me and I'll try and clarify, because I got all these thoughts going around. But the clinician can, going back to the false memories, influence what the client is or is not remembering. So, oh, tell me more about your past lives and what was there. And just by that questioning, going back to the repressed memory problems of and all that in the 90s, just by asking certain questions, we can invoke a story, right? And then the person is telling the story, and maybe they report feeling better for being listened to, and you can basically reinforce this false memory is what's happening in a lot of these things. I would argue, if that made sense. Sorry if I went too far off there.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And in a Scientology auditing session, and in Scientology, because that's a belief in past lives. And I know we're talking about this from a scientific point of view, and there's other points of view in terms of spirituality, and that's not even so much like what I'm talking about. It's mainly like in Scientology, it's so absolute. It's absolutely this way that everything is recorded. It's absolutely this way that you have lived so many lifetimes. If it was said like, oh, we theorize that or we believe that, but L. Ron Hubbard always said and presented things with such authority, even when he didn't really hold that authority.
And this is a really great point too of persuasion, if you will. Again, it's been studied extensively by social psychologists who are looking at how do our social situations influence us, and that is one of the characteristics of persuasion, of getting people to believe a message, is confidence and certainty. And we can go, we can make some parallels to socio-political conversations. A lot of people are not big fans of when politicians talk in probabilities. They like human beings, we like certainty. I will solve this. This is the case. This is the cause. There's something in that appears to be psychologically reassuring for us. Okay, this leader will solve this. They have all the answers. So you're right. When it comes to cult, specifically, when it comes to persuasion, getting people to buy a message, being confident in your answers is one reason why a lot of people were buying what L. Ron Hubbard was saying, because he wasn't waffling. And this, again, to me, is, like I said, it appears to be a human need to a degree with certainty. And this is one of the reasons why I think science can sometimes be off-putting for some people, is because as a scientist, I use probabilistic language. I will say things like, this treatment will likely help you, but it does not help 100% of people. That's just not the case. There are too many variables. There are too many things going on. And so I can see how when we talk in probabilistic language, as opposed to Hubbard's certainty, how that would turn people off. And especially when it comes to things like meaning, right? The meaning of life. How do I improve my life? You're telling me exactly how to do it? Sold. So I appreciate that you brought up that point of kind of being careful sometimes about how direct and confident people are.
Yeah.
Scientists don't talk that way, or at least we try to be very careful and couch things probabilistically.
Yeah. And I prefer that personally, because I can be very literal. And so when somebody says something, I'm like, I don't know about that.
Your baloney detector should go off.
Yes. And then they're like, well, I mean, because I think it does. Then I feel like, well, then say you think. You don't know that.
Exactly. And that's the difference too between the way that I speak. I talk about evidence, right? What does the evidence suggest for that? Not what I believe. And I tell my students, it doesn't matter what I believe. And that's the beauty of science. Yeah. Science doesn't care what people believe. Science is about what the evidence suggests. And this is why thinking about logic and philosophy and science and thinking in those probabilistic terms one, you're expressing intellectual humility, and that is something, again, that some people have written about as what is called an epistemic virtue. It's a way of thinking that is virtuous. And by saying that, of the evidence suggests this, I believe this for these reasons, we're trying to be humble. And again, too, studying the history of science, most of the things that we know about science has changed, has been wrong. We used to think this, and now we think this, right? Like, even in the history of psychology, seeing how psychotherapies have evolved over the years to where we're going more towards transdiagnostic models and looking at processes that maintain psychopathology. I mean, this literature of psychological treatments, I think has been getting better to a degree over the past 10 and 20 years of looking at things transdiagnostically. So again, that's why I have to speak of probabilities, because it might change tomorrow. There might be better evidence tomorrow. And that's what we should go with, the better evidence.
Well, that's the thing that makes a lot of sense when it comes to science or psychology and the way that you look at things, study them, communicate them, where they can change. And in Dianetics and Scientology, it can never change because L. Ron Hubbard said that it is this way. And because it's a cult where you cannot question the leader, it can never change. And that's something that I think continues to bite them on the butt.
And again, going back to, talking about, we're on this path of, and we're talking about characteristics of pseudoscience. Science inherently changes. If someone is telling you, no, this does not change, this will never change, then they're inherently floating more towards pseudoscience. So one of the things that we talk about, like with my students, with critical thinking, is something open to revision? Are we talking about change? If you're not and you're being dogmatic, then we're probably talking about something that is not scientifically based.
That makes sense. I wanted to read you this other quote, also from Dianetics by L. Ron Hubbard. And he says, the purpose of Dianetics is to take away the pain. It is not to build the organism up to a super state. The removal of the pain automatically permits the organism to grow into a super state. I mean, it sounds like a lot of mumbo jumbo, but basically, because he talks about this a lot, right? If you remove these moments of pain and unconsciousness, that will increase your ability. So people get into Scientology and Dianetics thinking that, well, if I can remove these moments of pain and unconsciousness and fully face them in a way that they'll no longer have a negative effect on me. What do you think about that?
I think the idea that there are psychological processes and things that hold us back, and things that we do to hold ourselves back, and quote unquote not operating to our greatest potential. Yeah, I mean, just on the surface of it, it seems like there's probably something to that. So for example, a lot of people with ADHD tend to report, one of the questions that I asked them, and there's this correlation, this relationship between people with ADHD and believing that they're not reaching their potential, because ADHD has incredibly impairs daily functioning, academic functioning, occupational functioning, where people are underperforming from their level. So it's like, nobody is always functioning optimally all the time. So it's like, if you want to say that, like, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But if you're then claiming, again, going into the weeds of what L. Ron Hubbard starts to say, of like, you've got to remove this to do this. It's like, well, no, if you want to get stronger, go to the gym. You don't have to remove anything. You have to do a new skill, right? So it's, again, from that point of, we can develop better skills. You don't necessarily have to remove something to go forward. You can just build on to something. So that idea of like, we've got to remove it, again, doesn't really seem to hold much water or much weight.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. And like you were talking about too, therapy and the way therapy is done has changed so much over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And again, Dianetics and Scientology, it does not change at all. What do you think about, so in Dianetics and Scientology, people, or even outside of that, take the idea of people who feel that someone who might feel broken or think that they need to clear themselves to be
Mm-hmm.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because the idea in Dianetics is you have to, and all throughout Scientology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Get rid of these incidents, these things that happen, and some of them have nothing to do with your current lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because this, when I'm thinking of these questions now, it's like what you said earlier just basically makes it all not make sense.
I've pulled the thread and it's all coming rattling. So, and a part of me is like, good, but also ask your questions because
Yeah,
these
yeah,
are really good
exactly.
questions.
So, what do you think about then so like the Dianetics procedure, which is you locate a time of pain and unconsciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see in doing that type of, Dianetics auditing and the way that Scientology deals with or doesn't deal with mental health by basically using a one size fits all? So
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's probably more accurate, a better way of asking it. The
Mm-hmm.
one size fits all approach in Scientology, what are the dangers in that when you compare it to actual mental health treatment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of you. I think there's a lot of dangers from the standpoint again of like opportunity costs, just not knowing the literature and just squeezing people into one box clearly is a misunderstanding of the human condition. So when I work with people in therapy, I'm looking at like, yeah, okay, they have these symptoms of these mental health concerns and like those are important, but I'm also looking at like what are their problems? Like a person could come in because they are depressed and it's like, okay, we can help them, manage their mood and kind of some of those things. The other part, I work with clients who have problems with ADHD symptoms, right? That are making them late for work. They're getting written up. They're doing all this kind of stuff. It's like, okay, that treatment is going to be different than someone with depression. And I want to flesh this out a little bit. How would that look different? With someone, if the primary concern is ADHD, what the literature suggests is the most helpful for them is to help people increase executive functioning skills. Executive functioning is an umbrella term that has to do with neuropsychological processes of related to like planning, time management, and organization. So if I'm working with a client who is having these functional impairments of daily living, I'm going to help them build the skills to increase planning, to increase organization and time management. We're going to do things like really reinforce and support their skills of consistently using a calendar, of consistently setting alarms. We're also going to do things called environmental modification, where the idea is people with ADHD aren't receiving as many cues from their environment to give them the cues to do what they need to do. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to help my client structure their environment by using the people in their environment to consistently check in with them a few times throughout the day. Hey, did you get that done today? We're gonna use things like helping them when they need to write a report, putting a do not disturb sign on the door and going to a client location. So that's going to be different than if I'm working with a client who is depressed and maybe even suicidal. Okay, we're probably going to do some things environmental modification wise of making sure like guns, implements are away. But we're going to do things really looking at, how are they thinking about their depression? What are they doing when they're depressed? What are they not doing when they're depressed, because they're not probably getting that joy and excitement. So again, what I'm trying to get to and elaborate here is, I've got two different people in front of me. They're probably going to need different treatment based on the scientific and psychological literature of the processes that are maintaining these difficulties. And so again, I'm going to tease that apart. I'm not going to be like, nope, we have to do this for every single client. If I can keep going on this, I want to flesh this out a little bit more too. If I could keep going on this, because I think this is another important point. What we know of clients who receive the best treatment or have the best quote unquote outcomes, however you want to measure that, one of the factors is does the client perceive the clinician's approach as helpful? So for example, there's what's called the outcome rating scale and the session rating scale. These are two 4-question assessments. They take like a minute to fill out. I have all of my clients fill them out. They're rating how they've been doing over the past week on the outcome rating scale. And then on the session rating scale, I'm measuring aspects of the therapeutic relationship, the working alliance, my relationship with the client, which is one of the top predictors of psychotherapy outcome. And so my client may tell me, yeah, I don't like what you're doing. I've had clients tell me this. I've had clients, and this is part of what we call feedback-informed treatment. Then it is incumbent on me as the clinician to adjust and be like, oh, okay, maybe using this type of treatment they're telling me isn't helpful, or the way that I'm approaching this problem. It actually happened recently. I had a game plan of how I wanted to do therapy with this client, and the client, kind of subtly based on the rating scales and some of the things the client said, based on the data I was getting back, I was like, I've got to change course. I changed course. They rated that session as the best session that we've had yet.
Wow.
So what I'm saying is, even on that individual basis, it's like, I know that this type of treatment tends to benefit this client for this concern, but what this client is telling me they need right now is a different aspect. And so it's up to me to kind of change that. So again, going back to your point of the therapeutic relationship is huge. And if I treat every client the same way, do the same thing for every client, it's not going to be helpful. And so to do what the scientific literature suggests is I need to make sure I'm attending to what that client is telling me that they need. And if I think differently, I'm going to have a conversation with my client. What is it about this that isn't working for you? What is working for you? And then that way we can recalibrate. But that is completely different from my understanding of Dianetics. Dianetics, the auditing, to me appears to be what we could call like sit and drill. And it's just bum, ba, bum, ba, bum, ba, bum. Just ask a question, digging. And it's like, we know that's not the most helpful thing for people.
Yeah, no.
So I hope that this was helpful.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And I'm glad you elaborated on that, because you're right. And I never really thought about it that way when it comes to Scientology, that how it's so different from therapy and that you can adjust to that individual's needs. In Scientology, you cannot do that. It's everybody does the exact same step. Now, you might have things tailored to you when it comes to interrogations. So if you have a family connection who works for the FBI, you might get some extra questions about that when somebody else, does not. But when it comes to the actual healing or getting better, it is all one size fits all.
Dianetics and auditing is the antithesis of what we know about the science of psychotherapy and helping people. Like when I hear, like L. Ron Hubbard is saying that you got to do these things to help people. It's like, no, like we know don't do that. And we know these things are probably going to be more helpful. So like, to me, again, as I explore this more, as we talk more, it just gets to that point of, if we're talking about it as a technology, as an approach, as a method, which Hubbard clearly states it is, it is not based on science. It is completely antithetical of what we know of the science. And to me, it just kind of hitting me even harder right now of like, no, this is not how you help people. Like, so it's maddening to me, and yeah, it's interesting.
It is very maddening. It makes me think too of the number of people who have some type of neurodiversity, whether it's ADHD or they're on the spectrum, who grow up in Scientology or come into Scientology, and those things are never recognized. My sister turns out had ADHD. Two of my three kids but we didn't know these things until after we left Scientology. And once you know it, you got all these tools. When it comes to people in Scientology growing up and not having access and it not being acknowledged, can you talk a bit about some of the situations or the problems that would create, especially for somebody who is more neurodiverse in those ways? Because again, Scientology makes no allowances for that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it appears to be right that the earlier that a person can receive scientifically based psychological intervention, the better off they're going to be, right? And so, again, opportunity costs. If we know that a child or a person is having these difficulties, they're not getting the treatment, whether it's a child or whatnot, it's probably only going to exacerbate the problem, or at least it's still going to kind of be a problem. Again, I go back to like ADHD, right? And I really pound the table because it's one of those disorders that I think still is incredibly misunderstood. And I pound the table because it's like, no, like we know how debilitating this disorder is. Same thing with autism spectrum disorder. Those are my two, I call my bread and butter, like those are the two disorders that I specialize in diagnosing. And I work with a lot of people, and I get a lot of adults, and as we're talking and they come in for like an ADHD or ASD evaluation, and they're telling me about all these difficulties and struggles that they've had for years, and they weren't afforded the opportunity to learn skills or to seek the treatment. To me, that's unnecessary suffering, right? Like that is something that it's like that shouldn't have been, and then again, we tend to see like, oh yeah, I can't hold down a job, or I can't do this, right? Like it has all these, especially with the neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and ASD, autism spectrum disorder, it tends to have, to a degree, a wide reach in functional impairment, socially, financially, occupationally. And so for me, it's like the sooner we can educate the child and the family about the disorder, how it looks, the sooner we can teach them skills and put environmental modifications in place, the better their life is probably going to be. And if that includes medications as well, right, which we know medication is a frontline treatment for ADHD, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics. So it's really frustrating to me when people are just carrying the suffering and these burdens that it's like in 2025, we know how to help people with these things, right? So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
It totally did. And I love how you put it. It's so accurate. It's an unnecessary suffering. And that is part of the problem with so many people who remain in Scientology or are raising their kids in Scientology. There is no acknowledgement of ADHD or autism or anything like that. And I've kind of had a theory, and well, you're learning more and more about Scientology and about the Sea Organization. And I've often wondered, based off the people that I've known and the things that I've seen in Scientology, but especially the Sea Organization, that the Sea Organization might almost in a way attract people who are more, I think, on the autism spectrum. There's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of scheduled, even though it's your schedule's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? It's a lot of the everything. This goes in the same place.
Yeah. I could see, again, it'd be interesting to see some literature on
Yeah.
this. Again, I don't, Scientology probably wouldn't want to do any of these studies, but I could see on the face of it for some of those with autism, with ASD that experience kind of that rigidity. I could see how that would be a very comforting thing for them, right? Like, and we see that with some people with ASD. They like to know what to expect. This is my job. For some people with ASD, that's very, very comforting. So I could see that as kind of being helpful for them.
Yeah, as long as they can do the same thing. And I've just
Yeah.
seen that a lot of times. I remember being in the C organization, and back then I didn't understand. I didn't know what ASD was. I didn't know what ADHD was. I mean, back then hardly anyone did, but especially in a Scientology environment. And I think this is one of the issues that makes Scientology so dangerous is the lack of acknowledgement and allowing treatment for things like ADHD or autism when you wouldn't, if the person had cancer or had just gotten their arm chopped off, you're not going to deny them treatment. But in Scientology, you are absolutely not allowed to get that valid treatment. In your experience, when it comes to ADHD and the autism spectrum, if somebody goes on years and years and years, and you kind of touched on it, but without getting any treatment, what would that look like in terms of it being exacerbated?
Yeah, I mean, and again, this would differ on an individual basis, probably, but in general, there's a lot of factors that would influence this, right? Like the severity of the disorder,
Yeah.
other potentially comorbid disorders, other just variables that could influence this. But I mean, one of the things that I think about is when it specifically, let's talk about kind of ADHD, if we will, people with ADHD are more likely than those without ADHD to have speeding tickets, traffic accidents, right? And tend to have difficulties having numerous jobs and they tend to have more divorces and marriages. So again, if we're working with someone that has these difficulties and then give them the skills or the things to manage that, whether that is medication, maybe I always think about like driving interventions for adolescents with ADHD. So adolescents and older adults are more likely to be into car crashes. Then you throw on top of that like ADHD. Well, we might have to kind of target an intervention differently for teaching adolescents to drive. So again, I've worked with, again, kind of adults, and they have numerous speeding tickets, numerous traffic accidents where they could have died, or they have numerous jobs. Sometimes when they come to me for an assessment, they're getting ready to get fired. And it's just like you talk to them, and it's like, you've done this for this long, like they've kind of skated by or whatnot. So what I'm saying is like this can financial ramifications. People with ADHD tend to overspend and have financial problems compared to those who don't. That is a huge problem with financial management. And we're talking about now increased like interest rates, right? Talking about, bills on bills, right? Like, those clearly have far-ranging impacts. If you're a parent with ADHD, you have this mounting debt. Maybe you're not buying things that you might need for your kids, right? I mean, I'm kind of stretching it a little bit, if you will, but these are things that people with ADHD would clearly, likely, some have these difficulties of. And so if they're not getting adequate treatment, like these people are in really stressful, harmful situations. And we shouldn't let that just kind of pile up. We should give and instill these skills in people as early as possible so that they can either strengthen them throughout life, so they can be more aware of their difficulties, to advocate for themselves. Again, if I could continue on this kind of rant here, I think about educationally. A lot of universities now, if we think back even 1980s, if you will, the student services on college campuses are nothing like they are today, right? So as far as academic accommodations, ADHD is a disability according to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that means colleges that receive federal funding have to provide some kind of accommodations or supports. That's become more of a thing now, where people with ADHD now, because we've recognized that it is a real thing, they can then get accommodations so they can succeed academically. And there's a movement too that's starting for helping those with autism spectrum disorder navigate the college campus, having kind of mentors and those kind of things as well. That's become something that's come to light more in, I would say, the past 5 years or so. So again, if we were to treat these disorders like they don't exist, we wouldn't see as many people probably with ADHD that are attempting college and getting into college, and ASD getting into college and trying to better themselves. If we acted like it wasn't a thing, they would probably be stuck in certain socioeconomic statuses, not be able to advance their careers, et cetera, et cetera. I hope I stuck on point for that one.
No, that totally makes sense. And that's what we would see a lot in Scientology is, people who struggle with those things, not getting the help that they need. It's hard enough on the average person.
Yep.
But then when you add in, if you have another, like an ADHD or ASD or bipolar or anything like that, it just becomes compounded. And what we end up seeing are people, there is a crazy high number of people with suicidal ideation and who even carried it out. There are people who attempted to unalive themselves like that just to get out of the organization, because if they think that you're what would they call it, like a mental case, that then they'll get rid of you and you'll be gone. But you're punished. A lot of what you're saying of the accommodations that have been made in academics, or when you're working with patients and you're helping them learn these skills, that doesn't exist in Scientology. You just have to perform. And if you can't, it's because you have misunderstood words, or you have evil thoughts and purposes, or you're committing crimes. So now, on top of the person already struggling because of some type of neurodiversity, now they're being punished for it. Now we're really going to come down on you, and we're going to sleep deprive you, and we're going to put you on rice and beans instead of food. And do physical punishment. You have to do manual labor, stay up all night.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, right? Is like when getting to that idea of, kind of quote unquote, this is your fault, quote unquote. Now, I always say, things are our responsibility, right? But we did not ask to be born with the brains that we're born with, or the way that they process information. We didn't ask to, have great memories or poor memories, or high intelligence or lower intelligence, or any of these kinds of things. We didn't ask for that. So there is a level of evil in that idea of like, this is all your fault. And then, like you're saying with Scientology, and reinforcing that, which we know that people can then internalize that, feel depressed, feel worse off, and then get into these, again, really awful situations where they do things to harm themselves. And to me, that just blows my mind that, again, an organization that claims to help people is actively doing things to shame people for things that are not their fault. I mean, again, talking about SA, right? And then like, what were you wearing, right?
Yeah.
You get like those kind of, or, why were you even around them? It's like, whoa. Like, wait a minute. Nobody asks for SA. That by definition of why it's SA, it's like that victim blaming, right? Which could then increase guilt, shame, which then those are very powerful emotions that could lead to other, again, really unfortunate actions.
That would explain too why I think there's such a high incidence of self-harm that happens within, especially in the C organization, and even after leaving, because there are a lot of people who will leave Scientology or leave the C organization and not have any contact with any type of a mentor, or and you all already have this distrust of psychologists and psychiatry because of what L. Ron Hubbard said. And even though logically, like, okay, if Scientology was BS, that's probably BS too. If you were raised in Scientology, it is so deeply ingrained. It is hard. I know people who were even adults that joined Scientology, left years later, and still struggled for years to be okay with getting therapy.
And that's, you hit on a really important point, right? Of this idea of these messages that are being indoctrinated, that people are perceiving and hearing, are very powerful, and there's something about, especially when we blame the victim and when people internalize that, that's what I call like a really sticky thought, that sometimes people really hold that thought tightly, and they really get wrapped up in that thought of, I'm a bad person, I'm no good, I don't deserve help. Right? Yes. And I think, again, those messages are traps, right? And the good thing is we can get out of those traps because they're just thoughts. They're not true, right? So we can, but they're very insidious, and they do hold people back. And so that's why I'm always kind of, again, pounding the table of, if your loved one was struggling to the degree that you're struggling, what would you tell them? What would you say to them? Can you offer that same peace and love and grace to yourself that you would offer to someone else? To just get them to kind of think about opening up to those ideas. But again, I'm rambling, but going back to your point, those ideas of it's your fault, shame, those are very powerful emotions, very powerful thoughts. And I can see how they leave a scar. It sounds like what we're getting at is they leave a scar.
Yes.
That's always just kind of there, right?
Yeah, and then you never want to reach out for help because you've been told the whole time that it's completely, it's just totally, utterly, completely your fault. I can just see this. If Scientology would even do something as simple as just allow in what we know today. We know scientifically so much more about the brain and how things work than we did in 1950 when Dianetics was written, or when L. Ron Hubbard was doing his drug-induced research. The lack of acknowledgement that things have changed and we know more, but Scientology cannot change. And that is where people end up getting stuck. And I'm very surprised when I talk to you at the amount of grace and kindness that you have when you talk about people with these conditions. And because I've spoken to therapists, but like cognitive behavioral therapists, I've never spoken to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And I guess I didn't really know, but in my head, and it's probably left over from Scientology, I thought it would be more hardcore and, no, you need to do this. And it's actually, every time I talk to you, it is the opposite. There's so much understanding there. It is literally the polar opposite of Scientology.
Yeah. And I appreciate you saying those things. Those are really, really kind. And I operate from the assumption of, Honestly, I just try to be a good person. I literally, as cliche as it sounds, like I just try to be a good person and or operate from the idea of the Buddha, who says, at least if you can't do good, at least do no harm, right? But I do care about people, and I think there are clearly differences in the way clinicians practice. There are clearly some that are more rigid than I am. I always go back to, what does the science say? One, I just try to be a good person. And then two, when it comes to helping people, browbeating people, telling them that I have all the answers, that my way is the true way. Like, those are things that just don't work in human relationships, right? And psychotherapy is predicated on a relationship. So I go off with, like, what does the literature say? So you get to a good point too of the therapist and the client characteristics are very important for treatment outcome, right? Some people do like a more kind of direct, nope, we're going to do this, 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 and this. Some clients like that. And again, kind of what I was saying earlier, if you like that, then that's great. Some clients, they need something a little bit different. And I have this hypothesis. I've never really, I'm unaware of any literature on this, but I hypothesize that the clinicians that are more flexible in their thinking, in their treatment, and their working with clients, probably their clients have better outcomes with however you mean that. Because again, going back to intellectual humility and, like, I just want to help the client. If they're telling me that this isn't working, I need to do something else, right? So what I'm saying in my rambling to a degree is, for those of you who are in counseling, in therapy, working with someone, if the clinician, if you don't feel that there's a match, first talk to the clinician about that, what's working, what's not working. But also, I tell all of my clients, if I am not helpful for you, please tell me. I will help you find someone else who works with you better. And I again, if you're with a clinician that can't even have a conversation, that's a red flag. That's like, okay, I probably do need to meet with someone else. So I guess what I'm kind of going this way is looking at these therapist characteristics. Do you feel heard, understood, respected by the therapist? Are they implementing scientifically based treatments? Are they answering your questions? Those are signs that clinician's probably going to be more likely to be helpful. If the clinician gets defensive, which would just be kind of weird in general, but it happens. People are people. But if the clinician is defensive about questions, if they're very argumentative, if they're inflexible, I would say that those are characteristics of a clinician that probably aren't going to be as helpful. And again, I go back to the great thing about the United States and healthcare, to a degree, vote with your feet. I know it takes a lot. And I talk with clients, I always ask them, what was your previous experience? If they've had experience in therapy, what worked, what didn't work? And even talking to my friends and family and other people, I always go back to go to the person that you think is the most helpful. If you don't think this person is helpful for you, why continue to go? And if it hurts, the clinician's feelings, so what? It's your life.
Yeah, exactly. Those are great tips on kind of like how to go and find a therapist. Are there any others that you have when people are thinking of seeking out therapy, of what?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's overwhelming. You look at a list of names and you don't know what to look for. What should you look for?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Natalie. That is a great question. So, again, I always go to ask the therapist, have you worked with someone that's had similar difficulties as I have? What is your licensure? So, for example, the term therapist is what we call an unprotected term. It's just a general phrase. The term psychologist or master's level psychologist is those are legal licensure phrases, like not just anybody could call themselves a psychologist or a master's level psychologist, those kind of things. So asking people like, what is your licensure? You know, are you a limited licensed psychologist? Are you a psychologist? Are you a counselor? Are you a marriage and family therapist? And they should display their licensure. Their licensures are supposed to be displayed. So ask them their licensure. Ask them if they've worked with someone with similar difficulties as yourself. Ask them, you know, what type of scientifically based treatment do you use? You know, and again, I go back to Division 12 of the American Psychological Association. The Division 12 is the Division of Clinical Psychology. And on there, they have a list of scientifically supported treatments. And so, you know, a clinician should be using one of those, and they should be monitoring the therapeutic alliance. They should be asking, you know, how is this going? How is our work going together? And they should be measuring if you are getting better. And what I mean by better, let's say, for example, let's say that someone has a problem with alcohol consumption, and that's why they came in to work with me. Then I would say, okay, I would get a baseline. How much are you drinking? How often? And then we would create goals of, okay, well, it sounds like you want to decrease your drinking. What would you like to get you to? Maybe they're drinking, you know, I've worked with a lot of people with substance abuse problems as well. And, you know, maybe they're drinking a 24 pack a night. And then it's like, okay, maybe their goal is to drink a 12 pack, at least, you know, a 12 pack a night, and then by the next 6 months. That's our treatment goal. And we're actively going to be working towards it. And I'm actively going to be asking them, hey, how many drinks did you have? You know, and not berate them, just to see if they're getting better, right? Yeah. So this is a part of what's called feedback informed treatment, that the clinicians that tend to be the most helpful are tracking how well the therapeutic alliance is going and how well the problem is being addressed.
Yeah.
You know, again, if the problem isn't being addressed while you're there, why pay and go? And I always tell my client, this is you. This is what you want. I want to know that I'm being helpful. And so doing that by, you know, administering some rating scales and stuff. So degree, licensure, their experience working with someone with the problem. Are they answering your questions? Are they informing you of the scientifically based treatment? Are they measuring, you know, outcomes and goals? And are they measuring the therapeutic alliance? If you could find kind of those handful of things, you're probably in a better spot to receive help from that person.
That makes sense. What about Boldile Hill? I always wonder if I pronounce her name correctly. Boldile. What could you do if you know someone going to therapy for PTSD and you see from the outside that they're only getting worse?
That's a great question. One of the things when I think about, are my clients, am I being helpful to my clients? You know, there's the subjective component, but I also want to see, are there some behavior changes? And so, you know, asking a spouse, you know, hey, contacting the spouse, asking my client, hey, can I contact the spouse? Or can you give your spouse this rating scale, return it to me, right? To get some of that outside observer. So this is a really important point. If you're concerned about a loved one who isn't, quote unquote, getting better or getting worse, honestly, to me, that's an opportunity to show your love for that person and being like, hey, you know, it seems like you've been in treatment, and maybe it's related to the therapy, maybe it's not. Sometimes people get worse, maybe they're going through a breakup. So we got to be careful about the causal arrow. We can't always just say it's the treatment that's making the person worse. However, that is a hypothesis. And honestly, I would talk to that person who, if they are in treatment and you're seeing that their behavior, you know, they're getting markedly worse, and using that as an opportunity to express your love, to express your kindness, your compassion, and your care, and maybe help them do some problem solving of, like, you know, is it the relationship? Do you need to talk to someone else? How can we kind of help you in being that support for them? So thank you for that question. I would my opinion would be talk to the person who's experiencing the difficulties and see if you can kind of what's going on, and if they need to see a different therapist or need to have a conversation with the therapist, then by all means talking to them about that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Jennifer has a question. How do you know if the client is being honest?
Great question. I operate from the assumption most clients are telling the truth. You know, again, I have worked with people that do not appear to tell the truth based on the evidence that I have, based on informant reports and other documents and these kind of things. So I'm not a clinician, and I know some clinicians appear to kind of talk about this, like, oh, like, is the client lying? Is this and this? I'm not really interested sometimes if they're lying or if they're not, because most people aren't lying to an excessive degree. I mean, we tell white lies, if you will, right? So part of, I guess, what I'm saying, because this could get kind of complex, is like, I would be interested if I did believe they were quote unquote lying. It'd be interesting to know what their motivation was.
Yeah.
However, even then, it's like, okay, you're lying to me. I always go back to, is this helping you? Because at the end of the day, it's the client's life. So if they're actively lying to me, that's probably not going to be helpful. So if I had inklings of that, I'd be like, we've been talking about this. This doesn't seem to match up. This is kind of confusing to me. This doesn't seem to match up. Is this conversation, is what we're doing right now, is this working for you? And then getting them to refrain. I don't have the time. And again, sometimes we can't ever really know if a client is being honest or inhonest. Again, we have rating scales that I administer in my diagnostic work and in my work with clients in therapy that can tell if people are answering inconsistently or they're over-reporting or under-reporting. So that's my long-winded spiel of saying there's a part of me that doesn't super care. It would only be harming the client. If I have an inkling they're being dishonest, I may reflect that back to them and see how that is or is not helping them, which I'm going to argue it's not. So that's a really good question. That's a really good question.
That's a good answer, though, too.
Yeah.
Comment from Poppy the Boxer. I worked as a psych nurse for 20 plus years and was CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy trained. So this is right up my alley. I'm loving these convos with Jordan.
Great to hear. And, I love me some CBT.
Yes. Cricket Cinema's question is, have you seen, oh, wait, no, we did that one. We talked about the TV show. Lily says maybe one of the students would end up being a resident counselor for the SBTV Foundation.
That'd be cool. That'd be really cool.
That would be cool. Regulator says, in addition, in Dianetics, there are also processes from Crowley's magic, such as the time track and the conception of engrams as demons, not subject to the control of the magician. There's that whole history of L. Ron Hubbard and Aleister Crowley and black magic, which is a whole other, it could be a whole entire kind of conversation.
Interesting.
Reintegrated Audi says, I am a clear. Recently saw a photo of my 8th birthday. I recognized only 3 of the 10 pictures in the people in the photo.
Interesting. Yep. Our memories fade.
Yeah. And often I'll remember something from my childhood, and I'll realize that what I'm actually remembering is a picture that I saw of something that happened. Yeah. I don't actually remember the event itself, but I remember vaguely that Christmas because I have a photo of me and my mom from that day.
Which, and again, that's interesting too. I'm not sure of any studies explicitly looking at that, but that is a really interesting thing of how do pictures and videotapes then kind of influence our memories? Because you're right. Like I've seen pictures too, and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. But I guess I don't really have a memory of that, or it's like influencing what I think happened. Yeah. These are all the things that that make memory research specifically like really, really interesting. And again, I urge everybody out there, go to YouTube, watch Elizabeth Loftus's TED Talk on false memories. It's fascinating.
It is a fascinating topic because think about how many interpersonal relationship squabbles are because two people experience something and they don't see it the same way. And some of that is maybe it's not, you tell me what you think.
Mhm.
Maybe that's not even memory. Like multiple people can see the same video and they will perceive it a different way. I'll do a video
Yeah.
on something, and most people I can tell are getting what I'm saying with the intention that I'm meaning it. But
Yeah.
once in a while, there'll be some comments or questions that are like, where I'm left thinking, did you watch the video? Because I'm not
Yeah.
sure where how you got to that conclusion.
Yeah. And that's, that's another really interesting looking at that output or that behavior of like, because I get this all the time too, relatedly, like being an instructor. And it's like, that's not what I said. And
Mhm.
this actually happens in therapy as well, where I believe there's a book by Irving Yalom, who's a psychotherapist. And I believe he wrote a book comparing like what he thought was happening in the therapy session, and the client created like a narrative of what they thought, and there was a complete mismatch, right?
Wow.
So you're hitting on like a lot of these things of in interpersonal situations, all these stuff. There are all of these factors that are influencing how we are perceiving information, either in a classroom, in a chat.
Mhm.
And that could be due to numerous psychological phenomena, right? Of like, one, it could be related to just mere attention, where the person just merely didn't attend to the thing that you were saying, so they missed it, and then they're like, oh, then they say something, right?
Mhm.
It could our understandings of concepts, our understanding and retention of some information is based on our previous learning and knowledge of a concept. And so we'll have what is called like a schema. It's this organizational structure of which we'll fit information into. So you have a schema of a dog, right? And then a child is learning that there are different breeds of dogs,
Mhm.
right? Like where they initially think like, oh, it's four-legged animals, but then they see a cat with four legs and you're like, no, like that's not a dog, right? So there are all of these various phenomena that
Mhm.
influence how we're perceiving just even a given situation, which is
Yeah.
another interesting thing.
It really is. That's always been so fascinating to me how multiple people will hear or watch the same thing, but have a really different idea of it. And I've always believed in the idea that we see reality more as we are instead of how it is. Because however if I'm having a bad day, kind of what you were saying earlier, right? I may see it differently. If I have a particular bias, I may see it differently, not exactly as it is. And I think as humans, that is one of our biggest problems is not acknowledging that and being okay with it. And I think for me, that understanding that or believing that has made it easier for me to have more grace with other people when it comes to them seeing something so completely different from how I did. I like to try to understand how they got there. I may not still agree with their point of view, but I want to know how you got there. And it's fascinating because how they got there often has nothing to do with what actually happened. It's because, well, the last time this happened to me.
Yeah, you're right. It is a very fascinating part of the human condition. And you're right. To me, it goes back to like acknowledging mental health concerns, acknowledging this is a part of the human machinery.
Mhm.
This is a part of the human information processing. And some people, there's some people who are called postmodernists that believe all knowledge and reality is socially constructed. I mean, they're just wrong. Like, everybody is looking at the sunset and these kind of things. but there is this idea of we clearly have our own experiences, and our interpretation of the world is clearly, you can think about it as like lenses, right?
Yeah.
Like we do have these lenses of which we perceive the world that are going to influence things. Again, some people take it to the extreme and say, oh, we can't like really know anything. It's like, no, like we can. We've investigated this phenomenon. We can all agree, oh yeah, the sun is shining, right? Things like that. But you're right, and this to me is like what makes the human condition extremely interesting, is the variability, the individual differences,
Yeah.
study of psychology, of the way people think, feel, behave, and perceive these things. So I like how you said that, of recognizing perceptions are going to differ. That's okay. We must recognize that. We must recognize the influences of that and work towards, kind of mitigating them in certain situations if we can, and just being open to being wrong. Again, intellectual humility. I may be wrong, right? Help me
Yeah.
understand.
It's a good way of putting it. Northern Girl has a great question. How do you go about getting information from loved ones who know the client the best? Well, I understand privacy laws. It's a big crack where getting proper help is concerned. So I think she's saying, if I'm understanding it correctly, how do you actually, if your loved one is not either being honest or doing well in therapy, they're doing much worse.
Yeah.
I've known people who were receiving quite a bit of therapy for a long time, but seem to only get angrier and angrier and angrier, and kind of stuck in a little bit of a negative thought loop where it becomes almost obsessive, and it's all they think about or focus on. So I've kind of seen that situation out at play, in play. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I try to do, if they're an adult, is I try to get them to sign like a release form. I said,
Oh, sure.
hey, and I say, I would like to get some additional information so that I can best help you. And
Yeah.
so, I would like to send this person this rating scale. So all the evaluations I do, or almost all of them, I'm sending rating scales to teachers, to parents, to significant others. Like I'm actively doing that. And again, it requires the signing of a release form. So I try to have that conversation of, I'd really like to do this. I think that gaining this information would be helpful for our work together.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's just kind of the way you go about it, because you're right, like with the privacy laws, with HIPAA, with all that kind of stuff. Yeah, you can't just talk about clients to anybody, So before I email a teacher a rating scale, the parent has signed a consent form saying, yes, we give you consent to do this. Because you're very right. I don't want to violate the law and my ethics of doing that. We can even kind of go in. There are some conversations I'll have with people about the acknowledgement of a therapy client in public. So I have seen therapy clients in public and have not acknowledged them. And I didn't do it to be rude. I did it to protect their privacy, because that could be a privacy violation. Because like, let's say I go out, I see someone at the store, I acknowledge them, they're with a friend, and then the friend asks, who is that person? How do you know them? Well, if they said, oh, that's my therapist, that could be a violation. So I don't even want to put my clients in that position. Yeah. But I'll usually talk to them. I'll be like, hey, if I see you in public, would you appreciate if I said hi to you, or you want me to ignore you? Right. So I'm kind of tying this all together as far as privacy. That's a great question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Could you kind of briefly talk about, no one has a question about CBT, kind of a brief overview of what cognitive behavioral therapy is?
That's a great question. Cognitive behavioral therapy appears to me to be incredibly misunderstood, probably due to the function of, one, I don't think it's always implemented super well. A lot of clinicians will say that they're, cognitive behavioral therapists, and I'm not always exactly sure they are. And also, it's an umbrella term. Mm-hmm. So, for example, cognitive cognitive behavioral therapy, if implemented the way that it is designed, is the most empirically supported, the most researched psychotherapy we have ever devised. It works. Cognitive behavioral therapy, what it is, again, it's an umbrella term. There's different types of cognitive behavioral therapy, but at its core, it says that our thoughts, cognitions, our emotions, our behaviors, our physiological responses are all bidirectionally influencing each other. My thoughts influence my emotions influence my thoughts, my thoughts influence my physiological arousal, right? My emotions influence my physiological, my behavior influences my thoughts and feelings. So really, some people will draw it simply into like a triangle with bidirectional arrows of thoughts, feelings, behaviors. I prefer kind of the more sophisticated with incorporating physiological responses and then looking at the situation. How does a person's situation influence their thoughts, feelings, and how they're all interconnected? And then when we have an understanding of the specifics of how a person's thoughts, let's say with anxiety. Okay, so I feel anxious. I might behave in an anxious way, like withdraw from a social situation. I might have the thought of, I'm going to do something really embarrassing right now, then feel anxiety. Then maybe I start to feel my heart race and my hands get sweaty. So these are all interconnected, right? And then I'm probably doing things that aren't helping me live my best life. Again, avoiding places, doing those kind of things. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, when I have an understanding of how those factors relate, we then focus on helping the person change their thoughts about the situation, about their emotions, about their behaviors, about their physiological responses. And we help them change their behaviors to influence their emotions. So what I'm saying in this kind of laborious way is we're really looking at changing thoughts and changing behaviors to influence emotions, because our emotions and our thoughts are tied together. Like we talk about them as, oh, here's my emotion, here's my lump of emotion, here's my lump of thoughts. It's not so. Like everything's kind of interconnected. So from a cognitive behavioral therapy standpoint, we want to have an understanding of what are the thoughts that you're having that are leading to your anxieties, that are impairing or impeding your life. And then we target, okay, how can we maybe think about this in a different way? How can we change how we judge this? How can we change the behaviors? So we help people approach as opposed to avoid. I hope that makes sense. If that doesn't make sense to people, please give me more. That's kind of in a nutshell. And again, there are various offshoots of cognitive behavioral therapy. I can talk more about, what's called the Unified Protocol for Transdiagnostic Emotional Disorders. There's cognitive therapy, Beckian from Aaron Beck, cognitive therapy. There are third wave behavioral therapies called acceptance commitment therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy that are kind of fall in the umbrella of CBT. So again, I could go off on those, but I hope that rudimentary understanding, I hope that was helpful.
I think that was a great explanation of it. And it's interesting how powerful our thoughts really are. I remember learning that our bodies don't know the difference if something's really happening or we're just massively anxious about it, right? We'll still get that feeling in our gut, the tightness in our chest. If we get we get all worked up over anxiety of something that's not even there versus there's a lion in the room about to get us. That we start making the hormones, like everything that goes along with it. So our thoughts are so dang powerful.
And this goes back to, understanding our emotions is important. And a lot of times, like when it comes to an emotional disorder, like emotions, like our physiological responses, they're automatic. And our thoughts are automatic as well to a degree.
Yeah.
But when we talk about like psychotherapy and we talk about helping people, by changing the way that we relate to our thoughts, changing the way that we react and relate to our emotions and our behaviors, by changing our thinking and our relating to them, has a very powerful effect on helping people. That is one of the core mechanisms. Our thoughts, our cognitions, is what we target in psychotherapy. We do it in a very scientific and deliberate way. But you're right, it is truly amazing the degree to which our thoughts can influence us. Can I give you an example?
Yeah, please do.
So for example, when I am stressing, I tend to be higher in stress reactivity. And as I've developed these skills, I can then kind of use them on myself. When I start to really stress, I ask myself, Jordan, what is the thought that you're having right now that might be causing you to stress? Are you afraid? Are you having thoughts related to fearing something quote unquote bad is going to happen? Oh, that judgment, my mind. Okay, I need to target the thought of judgment, judging something bad. What do I mean by bad? Right? Oh, something uncomfortable might happen, but it's not something awful per se. So again, I'm asking myself these questions about how I am thinking about my stress. And then, am I judging my stress? So we tend to amplify our emotional difficulties through judgment of saying, I hate this feeling. I wish I never felt this feeling. I want to get rid of this feeling. What the literature and the treatment suggests is helping people relate to that in a more open and helpful way. I'm not saying that you got to like the feeling, but instead of fighting with it, it's more helpful when I say to myself, I am stressed. Okay, I can now take a deep breath in through my nose and out through my mouth and regulate my physiology. I can understand and say, you know what? It is okay that I'm stressed right now. This isn't a bad thing. My mind is trying to protect me, and I can gain kind of some distance from that. So looking at how I'm thinking about an event, my thoughts and feelings would be a type of CBT technique or mechanism, if you will.
A key tool of that seems to be in not judging those things. And in Scientology, it is all about judging. There's good emotions and bad emotions. There's emotions, and there's in Scientology, the L. Ron Hubbard calls it misemotion, right? When you're grief or fear, emotions like that. And so you're always judging these emotions as, well, no, I should not be crying because that is misemotion. That's a negative emotion that I should not be feeling. And then you never process things because you just push them off to the side like that.
And if I could comment on this, this is an incredibly important point of, again, so part of the education, when I'm working with clients, if they're having these emotional difficulties, and just when my students, when we talk about the science of emotion, again, our emotions are not good or bad. They are signals. They are signals that if probably evolved evolutionarily to then, they're signals that then kind of motivate us to do a thing. So for example, when I work with clients with a lot of anxiety, and if they're in this judgment mind of like, oh, this is bad, we talk about, well, if we didn't have anxiety as a species, if our ancestors didn't have that, if they weren't afraid of stuff, they would probably get into really dangerous things, would die, and then wouldn't be able to reproduce, right? So our alarm system in our minds is very, very important. And it's kind of beautiful that we have this signal for us. It's just then helping clients. I'm not saying that you're not having a problem. I kind of like to phrase it as, it seems like your emotional alarm system is overreactive and overperceptive. It's almost helping you too much. So we kind of work on recalibrating it, looking at like, okay, what is what is a situation that probably warrants anxiety and which one doesn't,
Mhm.
right? And getting them to kind of assess that a little bit
Yeah.
more realistically.
That's such a powerful tool. Recognizing that when I think I shared this with you. I lost my partner last year to cancer.
Yeah, I'm
And as
sorry
I
that.
well, thank you. As I go through the grief process,
Mhm,
I fortunately realized this, learned this fairly like maybe a few months, 3, 4 months in, and it's been about almost 10 months now,
mhm,
is that if I'm having a good cry or I'm going through some of his stuff and things come
mhm,
up and I just wanna, like, just go through the tears and just, like,
mhm,
let some steam out of the teapot,
mhm.
that it doesn't mean anything is wrong. It just means I'm just processing my grief, and I'm going to for a long time,
Yeah,
but it doesn't mean anything is wrong.
yeah,
That was life-changing for
good,
me, because
good.
then I could experience my grief as a part of this is just part of what I do now for
Yeah.
now.
And again, too, again, talking about like wrong, anything wrong, if you
Yeah.
will, but
Yeah.
it's, you're clearly having again, which I would argue, and I think the science likely is on this idea of it's an evolved mechanism. We're social creatures. Losing people who mean something to us stirs strong emotional responses. And that's okay. It means you miss them, you love them, and they had a big impact in your life.
They
And that is okay.
mattered.
Yeah. And again, too, going back to kind of like what we were saying with judging, you know,
Yeah,
again, that judgment of our emotions. These are good emotions, these are bad
yeah,
emotions are just emotions. They're just signals. That judgment piece, when we have those thoughts, we relate to them in that way, that's what tends to amplify them. That story, those thoughts of we can't have them. So, experiencing your emotions without trying to fight it and being like, yeah, I am sad. And
mhm.
that's okay because I lost someone that I love. That's the human condition right there. So again, you're right. I just keep coming back to that of it is okay to experience our emotions. Again, we can get into this, what you do with your emotions is important. So for
Yeah,
example, when I work with people that have a lot of anger, anger is just an emotion. It is not good or bad. Now, it tends to be what we do with our anger that is a problem, right?
yeah,
And or the degree, like having a lot of physiological reactivity, a lot of stress, a lot of anger, it tends to be related to coronary heart disease. So it's like we want to help people regulate that, right?
yeah,
But I want to go back to this point of kind of going back to what we said as well of just like our recognizing our perceptions, the way we perceive the world is different for a lot of things. We have these individual differences. Recognizing it and saying that is okay. Our emotions are an evolved part of the human condition, and that is okay.
yeah.
Again, that kind of how we relate to them tends to be the problem.
Yeah, it
um
seems that it's judgment that gets in trouble with everything, whether we're judging our emotions, we're
yeah,
judging ourselves, or we're
yeah,
judging other people. When I
yes,
think about where I feel most comfortable and how I wanna show up and the kinda like my homeostasis that I try to
yeah,
be in
yeah,
is letting go of the judgment, letting go of it on myself, because I think
yeah,
nobody judges us more than ourselves.
yeah,
That
yeah,
tends to be my experience. But then taking it a step further and going, can we not maybe judge other people so harshly? Sometimes people are going through a rough thing or they're so far in their healing. In our community of former Scientologists and all of the people never in Scientology, but all in on ending this cult. People who are never in Scientology relate so much, I think, to our trauma and how we experience it and how we're healing because they had a trauma that was similar, not exactly the same,
hmm
but it
hmm
resulted in those same type of feelings.
hmm
And people are so compassionate and helpful. And that seems to be the other key to it too. And I know selfishly doing my channel and doing what I do and sharing about Scientology, I do in large part for me
Mhm.
because it helps me to continue to process what my experience was,
Mhm.
but it also forces me to be in a position where I need to practice having more
Mm.
patience and being less
Mhm.
judgmental about people, things, and situations.
Mhm.
And the
Mhm.
further I get away from my time in Scientology, that is something that I value and I want to continue to work on. But
Yeah.
that judgment just kicks us in the asshole.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I appreciate hearing you say, because again, that's something that I also too try to actively work on. And going back to one of the types of cognitive behavioral therapy is called the Unified Protocol, um, for the Unified Protocol of Transdiagnostic Treatments for Emotional Disorders. This was developed by David Barlow. He's either at Boston University or Boston College. I can never remember. Him and his colleagues, they said, like, okay, a lot of these anxiety, OCD, depression, there are these mechanisms, and we need to target those, and they work for most of these disorders.
Mhm.
And part of the treatment, one of the components is teaching clients and learning non-judgment of emotions. That is a specific core module of the Unified Protocol. And so again, it comes from what we know of the science. Like, this can be very helpful in these kind of things. It's also talked about, I've dabbled in the past with some Buddhist philosophy. I think it was more of Theravada Buddhism. And there's a therapeutic modality called mindfulness-based stress reduction or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And those treatments with mindfulness, if you're practicing mindfulness the scientific way that it's supposed to be, for developed by a guy named John Kabat-Zinn out of Massachusetts General Hospital. He was, back in the 70s, he was the guy that really started this. He talks about fostering mindfulness attitudes. And one of the attitudes, he identifies 9. One of the attitudes is non-judgment. And so, like, again, that's one. It's so easy.
Yeah.
Our minds probably evolved to make judgments often, and it's probably helpful to, this is good, this is bad, I like this, I don't like this, and to put these things in the bucket. It works from a problem solving frame of mind. But when we start judging more opinion based stuff, people, places, things, probably not super helpful. And again, we know that judgment can amplify aggression and
Mhm.
anger and frustration. Oh, you're such an idiot. Like, you're driving, right? That person's such an idiot. They drive so slow. That is judgment. And that is
Mhm.
amplifying that frustration. So I think, again, hitting on this and working with people, and when it comes to well-being, catching yourself when you're judging. Don't judge your judging. That's one of the phrases used in mindfulness, because then a lot of people get caught in that. Oh, so I judged again. It's so bad. Nope. Don't judge the judging. Notice your judging, and then go on. Right. So
Mhm.
I'm glad that we're having this conversation, because it's something I think about all the time. I think we're right. If we can catch ourselves and be mindful of that, can seem to be a really helpful thing.
Yeah, because things can be different. People can have different opinions. And
Mm-hmm.
in my line of work here on YouTube, there's often differences of opinions or how
Yep.
somebody might do something or see something. And it's not always easy, especially when you have this shared experience of having been in a cult together. But it's
Mm-hmm.
definitely an exercise in that. And it has been such a tool, even in things that you would think. I remember once, even in things that aren't like a really bad thing, right? Just thinking
Mm-hmm.
like, why does it have to be bad? One time, I'm thinking in my head if I can share this story or not. Yes. This one time, I had gotten my gummies mixed up. Here in Minnesota, we have legalization with cannabis. And I took one that I thought it was a completely different one. And after about 30, 40 minutes, I started feeling really strange. And then I panicked because I was like, wait a minute, what's going on? Am I having a stroke? But then I replayed in my head and I went, oh, oh, dang, that was green, not blue. I just mixed them up because, like a dummy, I took them out of the packages thinking I would remember.
Mm-hmm.
No. But then I had this thought and I thought, well, why does it have to be bad? Why it's just this could just be an experience. And I thought, and so I leaned into that and thought, okay, let's experience it. I'm home, I'm safe, I'm chill.
Yeah.
It's all
Yeah.
good. And then I
Nice.
experienced it and the anxiety just went away. And it really helped me see too how that fighting something or judging it as no, 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 no ramps up the anxiety.
Yes, yes, 100%. That again, going back to, I use the term like amplifying and looking at, we're kind of connecting these dots, looking at how we're talking to ourselves, our
Yeah.
thoughts, our judgment, and those kind of things, how they can amplify the anxiety or they can help kind of mitigate it and
Mhm.
bring it down. And again, this is impressive, like because you are using mindfulness because you're catching yourself, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, or like when I find myself stressed, I'm like, oh. Some people's I'm gonna forget her name, but there's a great book called How to Meditate, and the author, she's a monk. I always forget her name, but anyway, she says the aha moment is pure mindfulness. When we have this or this aha, like
Yeah.
that is true
Yeah.
mindfulness. Like I'm truly aware and attentive to this thing.
Mhm.
So again, and like when I'm using mindfulness, therapeutically, I talk about it as a skill. And it again, I'm using it on myself. I'm consistently getting better. It takes time and I'll never be the best in
Yeah.
judgment, but I can
Yeah.
catch myself now of when I'm judging and then respond more effectively.
Yeah, and if nothing else, I found that and part of it, I think it's learning more of these tools since leaving Scientology, but also age. I'm 54, I'll be 55 this year. And I so much more feel that I understand that
Mm,
I can be having the time of my life. And because someone else isn't, doesn't mean I can't. Not that I'm gonna be, like,
yeah,
rubbing it in their face. I'm just saying
yeah,
that things that don't everything doesn't need a reaction or a response in that way that there's just something so peaceful about, minding my own business,
yeah,
enjoying a quiet time, doing
yeah,
activities of my choosing, and not
yeah,
taking on all of the chaos that can go on around us because I feel like
yeah.
we have enough of our own stuff to deal with. And when and I think for me, it forced that. I was already
Mm,
kinda getting there, but losing Tony, just like everything went away. And suddenly it was almost like I was floating in space with nothing. But then I realized, okay, this is an opportunity for me. It feels like
mhm,
my life is completely over. And I thought, okay, so that means I have an opportunity to build a completely different life. And I stopped trying to put my life back to how it was because it was never going to be the same. But I think that's our nature is to want to go to how things were. And instead, I started leaning into being okay or trying to get more comfortable with not knowing what was going to happen. And when
yeah,
I lean into that, oh my gosh, my stress level went down, everything. I found more joy because I was no longer so tightly holding on to, I just need to get on the other side of this, which is a very Scientology point of view. I just got to get through it and get to the end. And
yeah,
instead, I've adopted more of a, this is such an opportunity for me to learn and not put back
yeah,
things in my life that don't serve me. And I'm finding I have to figure out what does and doesn't serve me, and that can take time. And in doing that, I think it's taken all of my it's not just about the grief anymore. It really is about like, wow, this is truly an opportunity. And Tony used to talk about that, but I didn't understand it. He always wanted to talk about my life after he's gone.
mhm,
I did
mhm,
not want to so much, but now I'm like, "Oh, I get it." He wanted me
yeah,
focused on what would make me happy, what would bring me peace, and focus on that. It's just they're
Yeah.
amazing tools.
Yeah. Real quick, I saw in the chat. So the name of the book is called How to Meditate, a Practical Guide to Making Making Friends with Your Mind. It's written by Pema Chodron, I think is her last name. PEMA
Wait, I'm
CHO.
gonna put it in the chat. Making friends with your mind. And what's her name?
It's PEMA
Okay.
CHODRON. So first and last name.
And
Awesome,
someone had
thank
a
you.
question. What was you named something else? Oh my gosh, now I can remember what it was. You mentioned it twice. Another author.
Was it David Barlow?
Yeah, I think it was a woman.
Elizabeth Loftus.
Yes, that one. That one.
Yeah,
How do you spell Loftus?
LOFTUS.
And do you recall what it was she wrote? Or what the context was of that?
That was the video about memory and false memory. She's the one with the TED Talk.
Memory. Okay, so it's a TED Talk on YouTube.
Yep.
Right. And I'm putting it in the chat. That way anybody on the replay too can see it there. I'm just going to grab a couple of these comments too.
Yeah.
Juanita says, darn, Jordan, you seem to be an awesome therapist. Where were you when I needed one just like you? Congratulations.
That's very kind of you. I try to be helpful.
Yes. Jess LaBarber says, Jordan, could you venture a diagnosis on old L. Ron Hubbard after reading Dianetics? But I don't know. I don't know if you read Dianetics or not.
I haven't. No, I've read some of the passages online. Like I've found it freely available, but they don't have like the whole thing. And I refuse to purchase it. So if someone gave it to me, or I'm sure it's at the library, I've thought about checking it out.
Yeah, exactly. You know what we should do is a separate video on you basically diagnosing L. Ron Hubbard.
Oh man, there could be some quibbles ethically. So there's what's called the Goldwater rule. And this, I believe this is kind of more so for psychiatrists. It happened with Barry Goldwater, former senator. And basically, it was in the 60s or 70s, clinicians came out and said that he was unfit for office. And it created this big hoopla. And the American Psychological Association or the American Psychiatric Association said, clinicians should not be diagnosing people they've never met and do it in public.
Yeah. That makes sense.
It kind of changed a little bit, but to your point, I mean, he does clearly seem to be an interesting person. And you know, if I have a few guesses of kind of where I'd go.
Kraken says you can Google original Dianetics by L. Ron Hubbard, free PDF. Download.
Okay. I'll have to check that out then.
Hey, Trashy, good to see you. Let's see. So here is another comment here. Oh no, we got Elizabeth's last name. That was Deanna's question. Animal Audit Corner. Now, if someone was to get reprogrammed back to normal, how long would it take? I think maybe in reference to Scientology. That's a tough question. Some experts have said it can take an average of 12 and a half years to recover from Scientology. So assuming that's what the person meant.
Yeah, I would say that kind of it depends. And that's a great loaded question. You know, I watched the video. Who was it with you? Did you interview, or was it Aaron that interviewed Rick?
Rick Ellen Ross? We both did.
Yeah, so
I did it first.
Okay, awesome. You get to everybody first. Anyway, you know, I am curious about, you know, because he talks about reprogramming, and I remember he's talking about a gentleman that he helped kind of leave Scientology and stuff.
Yes.
I'm curious of, like, you know, defining what exactly do we mean by reprogramming, if you will. that term just kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies a little bit, because it's like reprogramming to what,
Yeah.
right? Or like deeper, regardless of those kind of quibbles, so I don't know what the literature says, but I do think it's a fascinating question. I look at it more of the sense of I'm interested more so in what is the average amount of time to when a person feels, and again, this would be hard to kind of operationalize, but till they feel all right, if you will, or where they feel maybe before they entered. Yeah, that would be interesting to see. So I'm not sure. And again, it seems like Rick has done some work on that, so I should probably check out some of that to see kind of what he's saying.
Yeah, and I think so much depends. It's such an individual thing. It just depends on so much, because you've got people who entered Scientology as adults, and you have people raised in Scientology with multi-generational families.
Yeah.
Which that takes on a whole nother level of needing to come away from that. And I'm not a therapist or an expert, but based off of my experience, I've seen people raised in Scientology. Sometimes it even takes time for them to even realize they were brainwashed. I know it did for me, just like you don't think that. My experience when I first left is I didn't think that I was brainwashed. I didn't understand any of that. Those terms were not in my vocabulary because I didn't understand that world. And the more I did, the more I was like, ooh, I was totally brainwashed.
Well, and it's that problem of you don't know what you don't know, right? And like you said, Scientology and these other cults are great at controlling information, where it's like, oh yeah, wait a minute, other people don't think this way, or other people do think, right? So it's like not until you are then exposed to the other side of the fence, if you will, then you're like, oh, you're kind of hit with that realization of like, oh, this is different. Oh, okay.
Yeah. This is a great comment. Poppy the Boxer says, OMG, I haven't practiced for a few years now, and in general haven't wanted to go back. But Jordan has got me excited again about CBT and working with clients.
Oh, great. Great.
That's nice.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Well, Jordan, we got to wrap it up. But yeah, we will definitely be talking again. I'm so glad that you're able to do this again. And everybody, keep your questions coming. If you're on the replay, put your questions in the comments, because I will go through and try and put those together so that when we talk to Jordan again, we can discuss that as well. We can kind of like go through some of those questions. So keep them coming.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you again for having me on. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for everybody that's listened and, saying kind things and trying to just help make the world a better place and all those kind of things. So I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Make sure you hit that like button before you head out, and hit the subscribe as well if you are not already subscribed. Everybody, I hope y'all get out and have an amazing cult-free evening.